I stayed downstairs for another hour, aimlessly flipping through channels. The noise from the TV was little more than background to the storm of thoughts swirling in my head. Finally, I decided to head upstairs. Quietly, I stepped into the bedroom, grabbed the clothes I'd need for the next day, took my pillow from the bed, and turned to leave. "Where are you going?" Laura's voice broke through the silence, hesitant and heavy with emotion. "To one of the spare bedrooms," I replied curtly. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. I spun around, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Jesus Christ, Laura, are you that dense? You still don't get it, do you?" Her wide eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't stop. "What you did isn't just some minor mistake, like overdrawing the checking account or putting a dent in the car. You've shattered our entire relationship. Do you understand that? I can't even be near you right now." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice from rising further. "Do you know how I feel? I feel like grabbing you by the shoulders and shouting, 'How could you do this to us? How could you be so stupid?'" She started sobbing, her face crumpling in anguish. I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned and left the room, shutting the door behind me. I left the house early the next morning, before Laura even woke up. Stopping at a local diner, I ordered breakfast and tried to gather my thoughts, but the weight of everything lingered heavily in my mind. At work, I managed to get through my tasks, though I was on autopilot most of the day. My mind kept drifting back to the situation at home. Every scenario played out in my head. The police discovering Marcus's body, Laura's lies unraveling, everything falling apart. When I finally pulled into the driveway that evening, there were no police cars, no signs of an investigation. But Laura's car wasn't there either. Inside, I grabbed some leftovers from the fridge, microwaved them, and sat down at the table to eat. Just as I finished my meal, Laura walked in. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting her bag down. I raised an eyebrow. "Am I about to hear an Amos struck again story?" "Not the police, if that's what you're asking," she said with a sigh. "It's the project Marcus was working on. There's a looming deadline, and his sudden absence has thrown everything off. I got stuck with it." "Well," I said dryly, "that's what happens when you go around shooting people. Deadlines become your problem." Her glare was sharp, but her voice softened. "It's not funny, Ethan. Every time I think about what I did, it feels like part of my punishment. It's just another reminder of how stupid I was." I didn't respond. She sat down across from me, grabbing the last of the leftovers. "Any talk about Marcus at work?" I asked after a moment. "A lot of speculation about why he's gone," she said between bites. "He hadn't missed a day or even been late since he started. Everyone's confused, but no one's come to me directly about it." "And what did you say?" "Nothing," she replied. "I just let them know how frustrated I am about being stuck with his project. That's all." "Well, look at the bright side," I said with forced optimism. "If you manage to finish the project despite being thrown into it at the last minute, you'll look like a hero to your boss." She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I can already see the headline. Project in trouble, just dump it on Laura? I'm not sure I want to be in that position. What if I can't save it? I can't afford failures on my record, not with everything else going on. I'll need this job if things fall apart." Her words hung heavily in the air. She looked at me, clearly hoping I'd reassure her that we'd work things out. But I stayed silent. She sighed, defeated. "Because of the project delay, I'll need to go into work tomorrow. Good thing we didn't have any weekend plans." "We do, actually," I reminded her. "That party at my sister's tomorrow night." "I'll be home in time for that," she said quickly. "Project or no project, I'm not spending all of Saturday at the office. If the deadline gets missed, I'll just blame my boss for not involving me sooner." It sounded like a risky move, but I kept my thoughts to myself. After dinner, I turned on the TV, pretending to be absorbed in whatever was playing. Laura lingered for a few minutes, clearly upset when I headed back to the spare bedroom instead of staying with her. The next morning, I slept in. By the time I got up, Laura had already left for work. I enjoyed a quiet morning, sipping coffee and reading the paper, savoring the calm. Later, I headed to the garage, loaded my golf clubs into the trunk, and drove to the municipal golf course. On the driving range, I worked through a couple of buckets of balls, focusing on my grip and trying to correct my tendency to lift my head during the swing. The repetitive rhythm was a welcome distraction, giving me a brief reprieve from the chaos waiting for me back home. The sharp crack of the golf ball against the driver did little to alleviate the tension coiling in my gut. "Keep your head down," I muttered to myself, lining up another shot. But it was no use. Laura's betrayal, the sheer audacity of it, replayed in my mind like a broken record, drowning out the usual rhythm of my swing. My drives were erratic, my focus shattered. Frustration mounting, I moved to the putting green, hoping the methodical nature of the short game would calm my thoughts. It didn't. The more I tried to concentrate on the subtle slopes and the delicate touch required, the more vividly I pictured Laura with him, the image searing itself onto my brain. Defeated, I retreated to the clubhouse, seeking solace in the numbing embrace of a cold beer, maybe two. The familiar faces of my golfing buddies offered a temporary respite. Their easy banter and lighthearted jokes provided a momentary distraction, a fleeting sense of normalcy in a world that suddenly felt off-kilter. But the laughter felt hollow, the camaraderie forced. The looming confrontation with Laura, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, hung over me like a dark cloud. Later, as we prepared to leave for my sister's party, a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Laura, her movements hesitant, her eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and defiance, finally broke the silence. "How are we going to play this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Play what?" I countered, though I knew exactly what she meant. The charade, the pretense of normalcy. "At the party," she clarified, her voice gaining a hint of steel. "Are we going to pretend everything is fine? Act like the loving couple everyone expects us to be?" "What other choice do we have?" I retorted, the bitterness in my voice undeniable. Her eyes narrowed. "Then you'll need to be a bit more convincing than you've been these past few days," she said, her tone laced with a warning. "I can handle it," I said curtly, the keys digging into my palm. She held my gaze for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, before turning away, her attention fixed on the passing scenery as we drove. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. The party was an ordeal. Every smile felt strained, every affectionate gesture a performance. We were actors on a stage, playing our roles for an audience oblivious to the turmoil beneath the surface. The weight of our secret, the knowledge of Laura's infidelity, poisoned every interaction, every shared laugh. On the drive home, the tension in the car was palpable. Laura, unable to bear the silence any longer, finally spoke. "When are you going to come back to our bed?" she asked, her voice soft, almost pleading. Surprisingly, the anger that had been simmering within me had subsided, replaced by a weary resignation. "I'm not sure," I admitted, my voice heavy with sadness. "I'm still trying to process everything, to deal with the thoughts and emotions your actions have unleashed." Her silence was a heavy weight in the confines of the car. The rest of the drive was punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh. Back home, the weight of our fractured reality settled upon us. Laura, her face etched with remorse, turned to me, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "What do I need to do to prove that Marcus was a mistake? That it meant nothing?" "I don't know if there's anything you can do to change how I feel," I replied, my voice devoid of anger, only a deep, aching sadness. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "Then when will you at least let me start proving that I love you, that I want to make things right?" "I don't know, Laura," I said, meeting her gaze. "There are still too many unanswered questions." "What questions?" she asked, her voice rising in frustration. "You know what they are," I said, my tone unwavering. "But now I have a new one." Her brow furrowed. "What is it?" "You mentioned that Marcus boasted about sharing you with his friends," I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. If he was that reckless, he might have STDs. Did he pass anything to you? And if so, did you pass it to me? The blood drained from her face, her eyes widening in horror. I told you I insisted on a condom, she stammered, her voice laced with panic. Yes, I continued, my voice calm. But did you check it afterward? Did you make sure it hadn't broken? You can get HIV from a French kiss if the other person is infected. Her face, already pale, turned ashen. She looked away, her distress evident. It was clear she hadn't considered that possibility. After a long, agonizing silence, she whispered, I'll get tested first thing Monday. Good, I said, my voice tight. I should probably get tested too. She turned away, her shoulders slumping. Good night, I added, before escaping to the sanctuary of the spare bedroom, leaving her to grapple with the consequences of her actions. Sunday morning offered no respite. I slept late, the nightmares chasing me even in slumber. The day was spent in a haze of chores, the mundane tasks a welcome distraction from the emotional storm raging within. Laura, sensing my need for space, kept her distance, her presence a constant reminder of the betrayal that had shattered our world. By late afternoon, I had showered and changed, steeling myself for another public performance. When I came downstairs, Laura approached me tentatively, her eyes filled with uncertainty. What are we doing for dinner? She asked, her voice small. I knew what she was really asking. Sunday dinners out were our tradition, a ritual we rarely broke. And even though the thought of sitting across from her, pretending everything was normal, made my stomach churn, I knew we had to maintain the facade. Any sign of discord could raise suspicion, especially with the police investigation looming. With a sigh of resignation, I grabbed my jacket. Fine, let's go. The relief on her face was palpable. She followed me out the door, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words and the weight of our uncertain future. It was vital that we appeared as the perfect, loving couple. Anyone who interacted with us needed to walk away thinking our relationship was not only intact, but enviable. I made it crystal clear to Laura. No signs of resentment, no tension, only smiles. We went to dinner at Marlowe's, a popular spot where we often ran into acquaintances. Sure enough, we bumped into a few familiar faces. Laura played her part flawlessly, going to great lengths to look stunning and captivating, clearly hoping to spark something between us. I played along, offering the occasional warm smile and affectionate gesture for the benefit of onlookers. But when the night ended and we returned home, I still went to the spare bedroom. Whatever facade we presented in public, I couldn't bring myself to pretend in private. Monday through Wednesday passed in an uneasy routine. At work, Laura told me, her colleagues were abuzz with speculation about Marcus's sudden disappearance. However, no one seemed to question Laura specifically, which reassured me that no one suspected her involvement. On Wednesday, Laura went to her card group for the first time since the incident. She explained her previous absence by claiming she had been feeling unwell due to her pregnancy. The women offered their sympathy, sharing their own pregnancy experiences, and seemed to accept her excuse without suspicion. The bubble of relative calm burst on Thursday morning. The newspaper carried a headline about the discovery of a man's body. According to the article, Marcus's mother had grown concerned after nearly a week of not hearing from him and being unable to reach him by phone. She went to his home and found him dead on his bedroom floor. The report noted that he had been shot, and the police were asking the public for any information that could aid their investigation. That evening over dinner, Laura mentioned that the news of Marcus's murder had dominated conversations at work. Everyone's talking about it, she said, her tone uneasy. But no one's looking at me suspiciously. No one's asked me for my thoughts on it. I nodded, not wanting to add to her anxiety. On Friday, Laura texted me mid-morning to say detectives had come to her office. At 11 a.m., 2 detectives visited her workplace, seeking any information that might help with their investigation. According to Laura, no one had anything significant to share. A few people mentioned that Marcus hadn't been with the company long enough for anyone to really know him, she said later that evening. The detectives handed out business cards before leaving and asked everyone to call them if they remembered anything later. But Laura's nerves were unraveling as the weekend wore on. She was terrified that Mara, or someone else, might mention the kiss they'd seen in the parking lot. Her fears materialized on Monday. The detectives returned to Laura's office, this time asking specifically to speak with her. She told me about the conversation later that evening, her voice trembling as she recounted it. "They seemed to have information," she said, "something that made them think I'd been close with Marcus. They asked how well I knew him." "What did you say?" I asked. "I told them I didn't know him very well. I explained that while I'd danced with him a few times during after-work drinks, I'd also danced with other male colleagues. That seemed to throw them off for a moment, but then they asked if I'd ever kissed anyone in the parking lot." Her hands trembled as she continued. "I admitted that I'd occasionally kissed coworkers goodbye in the parking lot. It wasn't unusual, just friendly gestures." I frowned but let her finish. "They kept pressing," Laura said, her frustration mounting. "So I decided to get ahead of them. I told them, 'Let's be straightforward here. Marcus started hitting on me as soon as he joined the company. I told him I was happily married and not interested, but he ignored me. He kept pursuing me despite my refusals. To mess with him, I decided to lead him on, make him think he was getting somewhere, just to send him home disappointed every time." She paused, then added, "I said Marcus was arrogant, and even if I were to cheat on my husband, it wouldn't be with someone like him." I raised an eyebrow. "Bold move." "I had to say something to make it believable," she replied. Finally, the detectives asked, "Where were you on the nights of the 6th, 7th, and 8th?" "I told them I'd been at home with you," she said, meeting my gaze nervously. I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral. The story she told them might hold, but if they had any evidence contradicting her, the cracks would show. The detectives thanked Laura for her cooperation and mentioned that they might need to follow up with her as the investigation continued. She waited about half an hour after they left, before calling me to report their visit and everything that had transpired. I wasn't surprised when they showed up at my office just after lunch. What did surprise me was their approach. It wasn't what Laura and I had anticipated. They informed me that they were investigating the death of Marcus Decker and asked, "Where were you on the nights of the 6th, 7th, and 8th?" "Me?" I asked, caught off guard. "Why are you asking about my whereabouts? I don't even know a Marcus Decker." One of the detectives glanced at his notes before replying. "We have information suggesting your wife was involved with Mr. Decker. In our experience, husbands sometimes react violently upon discovering such affairs." My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "Are you accusing me of murder? Should I consult a lawyer before we continue?" "We're not accusing you of anything at this stage," the second detective said, his tone calm but firm. "You're considered a person of interest in this investigation. Our questions are aimed at determining if we can clear you from this list." I leaned back in my chair, taking a moment to think. "Why are you focusing on those specific dates?" I asked. "The medical examiner found that Mr. Decker's body had been decomposing for several days when it was discovered," the detective explained. The exact time of death was difficult to determine, but the examiner estimated he had been dead for at least 5 days before his body was found. According to his employer, he was at work until 5 p.m. on Wednesday the 6th. This suggests his time of death likely occurred between Wednesday night and Friday the 8th. I paused, carefully considering my response before speaking. "Firstly," I began, "you're mistaken about my wife being involved with Mr. Decker. She told me about his persistent advances and how she led him on to frustrate him. She didn't have a relationship with him." I watched their reactions carefully as I continued. As for my whereabouts on those dates, I was at work during the day and at home with my wife in the evenings. To reinforce my point, I picked up the phone and dialed my assistant's extension. When she answered, I asked her to make a copy of my day planner for the week of the 4th and bring it to my office. A few minutes later, she delivered the copy, and I handed it to the detectives. This is a detailed record of my daily activities at work, including who I met with, who I spoke to, and what was discussed. If needed, I can provide contact details for everyone listed. I gestured toward the planner. As you can see, I was in the office from 8:00 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. every day that week. Both my assistant and my boss can confirm this. My evenings were spent at home with my wife, except for Thursday when we went out to dinner. The detectives exchanged a glance, and I added, "I didn't keep the credit card receipt from dinner, but I can request a copy from the credit card company if necessary. Additionally, the staff at Marlowe's can verify our presence there. We're regular customers and are always greeted by name." I glanced at the clock. "Unless you have more questions, I'm due at a budget meeting in 2 minutes." The detectives closed their notebooks and stood. "That's all for now, but we might need to speak with you again," one of them said. As they turned to leave, I added, "There's one thing you might want to consider. If Marcus was hitting on my wife, it's likely he targeted other women as well. Wives, fiancés, girlfriends. It might be worth looking into those connections." The detectives nodded, but didn't respond, before leaving my office. I went straight to my budget meeting, but my mind was far from focused. That evening, when I got home, Laura had dinner ready. We sat at the table, eating quietly at first, until she brought up the detectives. "They didn't seem convinced," she said nervously. "Maybe not," I replied, but we gave them no reason to doubt our story. As long as we stay consistent, they'll have nothing to go on. We reviewed our conversations with the police, making sure our accounts matched, and that neither of us had said anything that could raise suspicion. For now, it felt like we were holding the line, but the weight of what we'd done, and what could still come, pressed heavily on us both. "We're not out of the woods yet," I said, setting my fork down after dinner. "We're probably still on their list of suspects until they find concrete evidence pointing elsewhere. They might come back a few more times, especially if they don't find anyone else to question." Laura nodded, her face pale and tense. Neither of us said much after that. After dinner, I turned on the news, hoping for updates about the case, but there was nothing new. Eventually, I picked up a book I'd been reading, hoping to distract myself and find some semblance of peace. When it was time for bed, I retreated to the spare bedroom once again. But no matter how hard I tried, sleep wouldn't come. Restlessness churned in my body and mind. Laura and I had never gone more than a few days without being intimate, and now, with everything that had happened, I felt the ache of desire mixed with confusion and resentment. I needed to make a decision, a definitive one. By the time the first light of morning crept through the window, I'd resolved to get tested for STDs that day, and to push Laura to do the same. If we were going to rebuild anything, it had to start there. When I walked into the kitchen, Laura was already up, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. She had a cup in her hands and another ready for me on the counter. I poured myself a cup, added cream and sugar, and took a sip before setting it down. "I'm going to get tested for STDs today," I said, watching her reaction closely. To my surprise, she responded without hesitation. "I already did," she said. "I went during my lunch break yesterday. I should get the results today." Her words caught me off guard, but I kept my expression neutral. "Call me when you get them." "Why?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "Should I dare to hope this will change your attitude toward me?" I shrugged, finishing my coffee without answering. Then I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. As I drove to work, I weighed my options for what felt like the 1,000th time. Stay or leave? The reasons for staying were compelling. The baby Laura was carrying, and the many good years we'd shared before this betrayal. But the reasons for leaving loomed just as large. The deep mistrust I now felt, the lies, and the knowledge that our relationship might never fully recover. It always came back to the baby. If the child was mine, I wanted to be a full-time father. I didn't want my child to grow up shuffling between homes, dealing with the kind of split life I'd experienced as a kid. but the uncertainty of whether the baby was actually mine made everything more complicated. Laura's betrayal had shattered my trust. Now everything she said or did was colored by doubt. I still loved her, and I was still attracted to her, but I wasn't sure love and attraction were enough to sustain a relationship built on such a fragile foundation. When I arrived at work, I immediately called my doctor and scheduled an appointment to get tested. He told me I could come in any time, and a nurse would handle the blood work. The results would be ready in a day or two. I left the office half an hour early during lunch to get it done, hoping that taking action might ease my restless mind. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and emails, but my thoughts never strayed far from the decision I needed to make. By the time I was driving home, I'd made up my mind. I would stay. Even if the baby wasn't mine, it would still need a father. And I wasn't willing to walk away, no matter how painful staying might be. If the child wasn't mine, it would serve as a constant reminder of Laura's betrayal. But I had already accepted that trust between us might never fully heal. Of course, I knew there was another question hanging over everything. Would Laura and I even be free when the baby arrived? Or would we both end up behind bars? Just as I was about to hit the garage door opener, my phone buzzed. It was Laura. I got the call from the clinic, she said. I'm clean, no diseases. Her words came with a wave of relief. Since Laura was the only person I'd been with since we became serious, her clean bill of health meant I didn't need to worry about my own results. As I pulled into the garage, I made another decision. I would start being a bit warmer toward her. If I was going to stay, I had to contribute to healing our relationship. But I wasn't going to make it easy for her. I intended to keep the threat of leaving as a lingering possibility. She needed to feel the same emotional turmoil she'd caused me, just enough to ensure she never forgot the cost of her actions. The weight of everything Laura had caused me still pressed heavily on my mind. I planned to tell her I would stay until the baby was born, and we could determine if it was mine. However, I wouldn't reveal that my decision to stay was already made, no matter the outcome. As the sound of the car door shutting faded behind me, I realized something else. Telling Laura any of this might not even faze her. If she was confident the baby was mine, she'd likely just smile and say, "No problem, Ethan." Not a problem at all. But my bigger concern remained. Would we both even be free when the baby arrived? When I walked into the house, the smell of dinner greeted me. Laura had the table set, and a bottle of Merlot sat in the center, flanked by 2 glasses, both already poured. It didn't take a genius to figure out what she was hoping for, and to be honest, I was more than ready for the same thing. I decided to play my part, keeping things light during the meal. I listened as Laura recounted her day, mentioning that the detectives had returned to her office. They spent some time with the HR manager, she said, nervously swirling her wine. But they didn't talk to anyone else. Her words didn't do much to ease my nerves, but I kept my face neutral and nodded along. After dinner, I flipped through the channels, half watching the evening news and letting the TV fill the silence between us. Laura eventually stood, glancing at me hesitantly. "I'm heading to bed," she said softly. I gave her a few minutes before turning off the TV and following her upstairs. When I entered the bedroom instead of heading to the spare room, she looked up, startled. A smile spread across her face as I began to undress. Her smile widened further when she saw that I wasn't stopping. She had already slipped out of her clothes and pulled down the covers, waiting for me. "Are we going to be all right, Ethan?" she asked, her voice tentative but hopeful. "That depends," I said, meeting her gaze. "On what?" she asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "On whether you get away with murder." Her smile faltered as the weight of my words sank in. "Here's the deal," I continued. "If you don't, and I end up in jail for covering for you, I won't be waiting around for you." She hesitated, but tried to force a confident smile. "I'm sure we'll be okay. I'm confident I erased all traces of myself being at Marcus's place." "Maybe you did," I said, my tone serious. "But then again, maybe you didn't. Did a neighbor see you go inside? Did Marcus brag to someone about sleeping with you and mention your name? If so, did that person report it to the police? Even if he didn't, what happens if the cops question all his friends and close associates? There are too many unknowns, Laura. For instance, I pressed, what about the gun you tossed? What if it ends up on top of a pile when the trash reaches the landfill and someone spots it? If the police recover it, they'll run ballistics. They'll know it was the weapon used to kill Marcus. Did you make sure to wipe your prints off before you threw it away? Her face paled, but she said nothing. It's the little things you can't control, I said. That often come back to haunt you. Even if the police come up empty-handed and the case goes cold, the shadow of what you did will always be there, waiting for something to reignite the investigation. There's no statute of limitations on murder, Laura. And if they do arrest someone else and convict them based on circumstantial evidence? I paused, letting the gravity of my next words sink in. I'm not sure I could sit back and watch an innocent person go to jail. My little speech dampened the mood entirely. Neither of us said another word. She turned away, pulling the covers up to her chin, and we both fell into an uneasy sleep. The next 6 months passed quietly. The detectives didn't return to speak with us, and as far as Laura knew, they hadn't questioned anyone else at her workplace. Our son, Samuel Ethan Drayton, arrived on a warm spring morning. The moment I held him, there wasn't a shred of doubt in my mind. He was mine. Now, over 2 years later, it seems Laura might get away with what she did. But in the back of my mind, I can't forget what I once told her. That the shadow of what she's done will always linger. That threat will hang over her for the rest of her life, and in some ways, over mine as well. All we can do now is take things one day at a time and hope the fragile thread holding it all together doesn't snap and bring everything crashing down.